Eric Becker, welcome to So Money.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
Speaking to a future podcaster right now, and your latest act. I mean, you've had such a storied career. We're going to get into all of your learnings, your expertise, your advice. You have worked with over 100 companies in your career. Some of the most successful founders you have advised, ultra high net worth families. Let's start with the big takeaway. The big takeaway when you look across all of these experiences that you've had, what is the clearest difference between businesses that endure and the businesses that simply flame out? Because there are more of those companies than we know the ones that last.
Yes, so that's a great question. And I would say the first thing is that our society is really fascinated by what's new, what is disruptive, what happens fast. We celebrate it and it's wonderful and we should. But I also think that we really underestimate the companies, organizations, the families that have stood the test of time and been able to endure for generations. And so that has been an area of interest of mine now for 30 years to study them and to try and combine what's old with what's new. And some of the things that you find are counterintuitive. So, as an example, most people think that a 100-year business is probably stodgy, old, conservative, bureaucratic. But in fact, it's the opposite. In their DNA is agility and the ability to survive and a bias for action so that when things happen, they end up being the survivors. So that would be one example, but there are
Mhm.
multiple other examples that we can talk about too, like ethical succession and other
Mhm.
concepts. Really having a plan for longevity, similar to the way that we want to have a plan for longevity in our human biology. And it's the same in
Yeah.
organizations.
Yeah, I can see that those parallels of how you, even with investing, right? We talk about the importance of action and diversification. And, your book is called The Long Game, also the name of your new podcast. Do you think that most successful entrepreneurs go in with a long game plan? Or it's only in hindsight that we say, you know what? They played the long game.
Yes. I think that there are some, usually those that have the scars and the bruises from prior challenges or failure. I do think for most people, it comes from experience, life and business experiences of being challenged. Most people, I think, initially, there's this scrappy phase of a startup or a new venture where you're struggling literally day by day to survive, payroll to payroll, to figure out that you have the right business model, right fit of your product or service to your market, that you have the right team and the capital to achieve your plan. But long game companies, they do think beyond that. And so they think about culture first, and they're very intentional in the way that they design their culture of their organization, the way they
Mhm.
teach their culture to team members and to new people coming aboard. The level of competency of the team that they put together. Long game companies tend to have these culture carriers who also combine that culture with high competency, where they're very, very capable and expert in something. So they combine that, the kind of hard skills and soft skills. They have a plan for longevity and they're very, very much focused on culture, which I think is so interesting because we talk about culture and you hear about it, but sometimes people struggle to define it and to actually put the right culture in place.
Yeah. I mean, I think about a business in their first year, their first 5 years, this idea of having to focus on culture when maybe it's just you and a co-founder, those first couple of years. What is the right balance? Because you have to also build the plane and the day-to-day can be very grueling and grinding. So culture feels like really needing to take sort of a big step back and be very deliberate in ways that take time. How do you even begin to think about your culture and what it, because if this is your first rodeo, you don't know how to build a company, let alone a
Yeah,
culture.
I know. That actually reminds me, there's a great New Yorker magazine cartoon, and it's of a rodeo participant, and he's actually tied up on the ground by the cow he was trying to, and he said,
Yeah.
"This literally is my first rodeo."
Yeah,
But
yeah.
which is pretty funny. But I think that culture is so important to becoming a successful startup. And then, of course, if you want to play the long game, that as an example, when I started Cresset with my co founder, Avi Stein, we took 3 days. We took the first 8 team members And we spent 3 days just focusing on culture before we even did $1 of revenue. That's how important we thought it was. Avi and I had had decades of experience. You mentioned all the different companies I was involved with in my career, both successful ones and failures. And what I learned from the best companies and also from the failures is that culture is actually the differentiator. And if we were to look at, say, McKinsey, who has studied this in organizations now for decades, they find that culture is perhaps the greatest indicator of future success. And so you're right. When you are struggling payroll to payroll, trying to get it going at the beginning, it seems, again, counterintuitive to focus on something like culture, but it actually turns out that the investment in culture pays big, big dividends, and it's very important.
You also emphasize the importance of being aware of these moments of truth.
Yes.
You write about this in your book. How do you recognize a moment of truth? What do you mean by a moment of truth?
Yeah, so a moment of truth is it's really, really interesting. And I've done it now in two categories. The first was studying these 100-year organizations, companies, and families that have been successful over generations. But recently, I've actually been looking at a human life. And in both cases, really interesting, it turns out that in a 100-year company, or even now in a study I'm doing around human lives, it turns out that there's like 15 to 20 of these moments of truth. And if you think about it in our own lives, it's things like where to go to school, what to study, what field you decide to pursue, who's going to be your partner, whom you may choose to be a lifetime, get married to, having children, not having children, where to live. It's really, really interesting that when you add it up, like 15 to 20 decisions and key moments of truth define our lives. And similarly, in these organizations and companies, we find the same. So an obvious one, of course, would be COVID. That was a moment of truth where we had a pandemic and we went into a world that no one really had lived through before. And so everything was new. And our ability to adapt to those conditions and to survive became what was so critical. So what we find in looking at these long game companies is that they're very, very good at identifying a moment of truth. Now, COVID was an obvious one, but it could be a succession issue, like transitioning leadership from one person to another. It could be tolerating a team member who's really got a terrible way of conducting themselves and they're really bad for the culture and for really everyone feeling great about what it is that they're doing. There are many different, more subtle moments of truth, and these long game companies are skilled at identifying it and then most importantly, taking action. And so
Right.
that's what we've learned about moments of truth. It's a big deal.
I mean, right now, I would say we're in a moment of truth, the age of AI, right? So many companies, especially those who've been around for a while and are maybe slow to adopt and adapt. What would you recommend for all businesses? I mean, you heard about Allbirds, a sneaker company. Never mind, we're going to go AI. We're going full blown AI. That headline read initially as bonkers,
Yeah.
but maybe in a year, because AI is moving so rapidly, we'll go, oh my gosh, they were right.
Yeah.
It's obviously a big pivot
Yeah.
and strange to the consumer, but not for business.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just read that they were like in bankruptcy or somebody bought it at a very low price. Yes, AI is most certainly not only a moment of truth, but perhaps in our modern day lives, it probably wound up being the biggest thing that ever happened to humanity during our lives, most likely. And what I say and what I saw from studying these companies is the first is the ability to recognize and then to embrace and confront your reality. And so the saying is confront your reality every day. So when it comes to AI, one approach might be, well, in fact, I saw on 60 Minutes an interview with two gentlemen in London who were studying for what's called the knowledge in order to be one of the black taxi cab operators in London. You take like a PhD level course in navigation. And these two gentlemen, they were so excited. They had just passed this very difficult exam. One case, I think that the guy had spent 5 years getting ready for this. And they said to him, well, what about AI? What about autonomous driving? And he said, there's always going to be a human in this. People want to talk to a human. And he had certainly beautiful and very personal view of this. But I think looking at it objectively, if he was someone we were coaching, we would be worried about what his future is going to look like in 3 to 5 years. So I think there's one approach, which would be not confronting our reality, bad plan. I think the best plan is recognize your reality, confront it, and then embrace it. So,
Yeah.
as an example, everybody should probably be waking up an hour earlier every morning and spending 30 to 60 minutes learning about AI. Add that into your day. Sign up for Claude, sign up for ChatGPT. If you can, spring for the Pro Edition and really, and even say, I want to learn about this and make that a prompt and have it really start teaching you the different things that we can do. Embrace it. That's the way that we will not only survive AI, but ultimately, hopefully, thrive with AI.
Yeah, the education, I don't see a problem with, I mean, it's happening. The train has left the station.
It
And
has.
in your book, you actually write about, more legacy companies like Barnes& and Noble. There's the Biltmore estate. You have a lot of understanding of how these companies stayed relevant when others, Borders did not. What was
Yeah.
the difference with Barnes& and Noble versus, say, a Borders?
Sure. I think the biggest change would have been James Daunt, who originally was with, I think it was called Waterstone. It was a famous British bookseller. He took over Barnes and Noble and he took it over in the era of Amazon and e-commerce, and they were really struggling. And what he did, and so what I would say the secret was his strong leadership and then his conviction around finding team members who loved being booksellers, that they loved to introduce themselves to someone who was coming into the store, bring them to the book stacks, and to then help them find that great book that they wanted to bury themselves in and have a wonderful reading experience. And so he went from a company that probably had become just a traditional retailer, having people that were taking those jobs, and it was more sort of automatic. And he created this culture and passion for reading, and not just reading, but helping the customer to find that great book. So strength of leadership in the case of Barnes and Noble. In the case of Biltmore, super interesting because George Vanderbilt, who was one of the wealthiest men in not only America, but in the world, his family, he built Biltmore. It is fantastic, a true American treasure, but he built it for friends and family. It was for entertain. People would come down from New York on the train and they'd stay for a week and they would have great meals and activities. He had a hunting lodge. They'd go out to the hunting lodge. Really incredible experience. And then when the second generation came, the wealth started to dissipate, as we have seen in a number of multi generational families. And after the Great Depression, the town of Asheville asked the family to open it up to the public in the hopes that maybe as a tourist destination, it could actually help the community to rebuild from the terrible depression. And so they did. And that became a moment of truth and a next chapter that has allowed it to thrive now, ultimately for generations, and to become a top US destination, not only for the beautiful art and architecture and this amazing, the largest private home in America, but the grounds and nature and the way that they believe in conservation, not only of the rare, beautiful things that they have in the house, but conservation of animals and conservation of the land. It's really exceptional. And then the way that they have taught each generation to be stewards, and
Mhm.
that where each generation feels that Biltmore is much more than a family and much more than a tourist destination and certainly more than a business, that this is an American treasure that they are in charge of for the next generation. And they feel this
Mhm.
tremendous sense of responsibility for that. So they're always investing in the property. As an example, this spring, they rolled out something called Lumiere. And Lumiere is a beautiful nighttime lighting of the property with storytelling. So imagine projectors on the side of the home and they light it up, and suddenly you see George Vanderbilt in his library, like you're looking into a dollhouse. You can see inside from outside. You can have a glass of wine and have a nice picnic with your family and experience this. So they're always investing, always moving forward, and educating the next generation on what it means to be responsible for this for the future.
Listening to this, you mentioned Barnes and Nobles and now the Biltmore Estate. For me, what stands out, these two parallels, is these are the companies that they owned the narrative, or they sort of reimagined the narrative, and they really doubled down on experience. That is something that can endure even as technology takes over. That's very powerful.
I agree.
You've also emphasized the importance of, as a leader, and I love this because it can apply to anyone both in business and in your personal life,
Yes.
is to ask the question, what am I tolerating that I should not be tolerating? I
Yes.
want to know, Eric, what inspired that question and why do you think it works so well?
Yes, I love that question. And I ask myself every day, what am I tolerating but shouldn't be? And the way that that question that I learned about it is that I'm always a curious person and I love to study wisdom, whether it be Stoic philosophy, which you and I spoke about a little bit before this podcast, or other things that I've read. So one year I ran a contest and I had 80 board members of companies, figuring that they had been CEOs and they had experience in running an enterprise, 20 CEOs who were currently running a business day to day. So 100 of these leaders. And I asked them, what is the best question you've ever asked or been asked? And there was a gentleman named Gary Kiesling. He's a wonderful guy, a little bit older. He reminded me, I don't know if you remember those Dos Equis beer ads where they had the world's most interesting man. He was, in my mind, the world's most interesting man. And he submitted this question and it won the contest hands down over every other question, the other 99. And it was, he said, every day I ask myself, what am I tolerating but shouldn't be? And I adopted it. I've written about it. It has absolutely changed my life multiple times. I think that there's something about our humanness, that we are, we're not machines. That's the beauty of our humanity, our biology. We are imperfect. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. And I do think that there is a real challenge in life around rationalizing things. So, pick anything, a new exercise program that you start and you're a few months into it or a few weeks and you're like, oh, I'm going to take today off. And then that leads to taking tomorrow off and then it's gone. Or any other habit that you're trying to adopt. Or it could be in a relationship. Anyone who's been in multiple relationships, that's any life experience, we all had a bad or failed relationship at some point, even if you're lucky enough that it was early in dating. And think about where people tolerate a bad relationship where the person that they're with is really a really bad influence on their life. Think about it in friendships. That friend who is not contributing to the friendship, but really is taking all of your energy and really making life challenging. So there are many, many examples that we can come up with. But what I found is that by asking ourselves that question every day, and then I've added something to Gary Kiesling's great question, which is that I make a list of things of even just one step. So when I identify something that comes up, when I ask myself in the morning, what am I tolerating that shouldn't be? And then I make a list and I start with what's the one thing that I could do, one step I can take to start that journey to address whatever the issue is. Super, super powerful question.
I'm hearing a lot about the importance of taking action, even in this case, a small step. But when does it make sense to do nothing? Because sometimes action is a sort of, it's a reaction to something and it's human nature. We have these impulsive, instinctual, impulsive ways of dealing with challenge and uncertainty and all of the things. Is there ever a moment in business when it's best to just stay put as things are really changing around you?
Yes, I think in business and in life, I think the first thing is to understand that not making a decision or choosing not to do anything, staying put, as you said, that is a decision. So I think the first is recognizing that on all the choices we have, that maybe is the first choice. And so it is a powerful choice. And in Stoic philosophy, there's a concept called temperance, which means just the right amount. So this is such a powerful concept. I bundle it with the asking ourselves every day, what am I tolerating but shouldn't be? So just the right amount. Let's say exercise, right? If we overexercise, not good. If we're not exercising at all, not good. What is just the right amount? In decision making, there's something called constructive tension. Let's say that you and I have a project to work on and we're a team and we're trying to make the very best decision together. in order to do that, I have to be both supportive and challenging of you and vice versa. If I'm overly challenging, you may feel that that is negative energy and a problem. If I'm overly supportive, then I'm failing you in terms of being a good co decision maker. So I think similarly, just the right amount in your decisioning, which may be to look at a situation and say, you know what? I think that this is worth waiting on and seeing what happens. And it could be in parenting with a child where you choose to make that correction or that point or whatever it is. Or you might choose to say, you know what? They're going to figure this out for themselves and I'm going to give them some space so that I'm not overly controlling. So it's a very powerful idea. It's on your repertoire of things that you can bring to a problem to solve. And I do think it's interesting that you asked that question because it probably is an underestimated choice, which
Mhm.
is that sometimes doing nothing is the right thing to do.
We talk about that a lot with our investments. We have sometimes this desire to do something with our investments because of wherever the market is today or this week or even this quarter. But if you're in it for the long game, we just know, historically speaking, it's better to stay the course.
100%. In fact, when I was 20 years old, I worked for a money manager, an investor in Chicago, had a fund, and it was a fundamental value fund. So it was all about deep research, understanding these businesses, their balance sheets, everything. If they had patents, you had to understand everything. And it was so interesting how he controlled that urge to trade and controlled the urge to, it was a bad day. Should I get out of this position? And the way that he did it is that when he had the urge to take action in his portfolio, and it was a small company, it was just the two of us, he would come to me as the analyst and we would start to re-underwrite all the way from the beginning. And we'd spend the whole day going through, reopening our files, looking at it again. And he would sit on his hands and not do anything. And usually by the end of the day, that self-control returned and the work that we had done revalidated, the thesis as to why we believed it was a great company. And I would say 90% of the time, no action was taken. But he needed an activity and a process
Mhm.
for actually not making a decision or a decision to do nothing.
I love that. I love it because right, we wanna do something. I wrote a book called A Healthy State of Panic. So, that is the healthy
Great
panic
title.
move. We jump to the sort of the big action of changing course when really maybe instead we could do something else which would only reaffirm us of our initial position.
I agree.
Let's move on to something personal. You, I read, wrote what is called an ethical will. So we talk
Yes.
a lot about estate planning on this show, but this was a new idea, and I'd love for you to share with our audience why you became fascinated with this idea of an ethical will, not a financial inheritance, but it's a document that passes down your wisdom and your values.
Yes.
Tell us this story.
Yes. So the story is that one day years ago, before dating myself, before cell phones, before the internet, before all this great stuff that we have, I was on a flight and there was a gentleman sitting next to me, and I just struck up a conversation and we were chatting, and at some point he said that he was Mormon, and I knew nothing about the Mormon faith, so I just said to him, I don't know anything about your faith. Is there one thing that is involved with it that you could tell me that might be helpful in my life? And he said, yes, every week you should have a family meeting with your kids. And I was like, huh, a family meeting? Like that sounds like a business concept. Like I'm going to have a meeting with the kids, like a scheduled meeting. It sounds kind of funny. And he said, no, no, we actually have a defined list of topics and we actually talk about things, everything from, where you're from originally, like where grandma and grandpa came from, to family values. We have a whole list of things. So again, this is before the internet and even email, I think. And so I said, well, could you send me something? And a few weeks later, a manila envelope came and in it was like a stapled group of pages. There was a list of topics that he used in his family meetings. This led to starting these family meetings with our kids when they were young. Like I'm talking about probably our youngest might have been 7 or 8 years old. And we would have these weekly family meetings. Such a powerful concept and something I encourage your audience to consider. And we can talk more about that if you wish. That led me down this journey of discovery around what are things we can do to be a highly functioning family. And one day I read an article about an ethical will. And I thought, oh, that must be like our estate planning will. No, no, not a legal document. It's, as you said, it is family history, values, things that you want to pass forward, not just to your children, but to future generations. And as I continued to read the article, I learned that this is something that has been around for like 1,000 years, where a matriarch or patriarch of a family would sit down and write down the family history, the story of the family, but then also the things that they had learned, what we would call their hard learned lessons. And it really was a powerful idea. So I'm not a great writer. I know I wrote a book, but I need a lot of help with that. So I called the woman who had written the article, and she was wonderful. And I said, could you help me write an ethical will? And she agreed to. And that led to this collaboration. I ended up writing the document. I showed it to my father. My father said, this is great. I showed it to my wife, Jill. She really enjoyed it. And that was it. I didn't show it to anyone else. I didn't show it to my kids. And even as they became teens, I just missed this opportunity. And I'll tell you this unbelievable story, but we had 3 children, 2 boys. We had a beautiful daughter, Kara, in the middle. She was 21 years old. She developed leukemia, and she had the only form of curable leukemia in 2012. She was at Hopkins. We were so optimistic about her treatment and her future. But sadly, she had a reaction to her chemotherapy. And one night she passed away in her sleep. It was just this gut-wrenching, bone-breaking, just terrible, 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 terrible thing. And anyone who's a parent, anyone who's listening as a parent understands what a terrible thing that is. And so I started reading about it, and I read the statistics: 2 out of 3 couples that lose a child don't stay together. I mean, it was just bad news following bad news. And it was a very, very dark period in my life. I ended up retiring from my business, focusing just on family, on service to others, and around the idea of helping both leukemia and lymphoma, but then also fostering entrepreneurship and doing mentorship of young entrepreneurs. So while I was focused on this, but not really working in a traditional professional sense, and certainly struggling emotionally, one day I happened to open up this drawer, and there was the ethical will, and I pulled it out and I started reading it. And what was unbelievable is I at first thought I was reading about a different person, like this shocking event that had happened in my life and in our family's life had turned things upside down to a point where I just was lost. And now I'm reading this, and at a certain point, I'm halfway through it, and I'm going, I know that guy. I know that guy. That was me who wrote this. And
Yeah.
gosh, here I wrote this thinking it was for future generations. I never showed it to our kids. I was so sad that I'd never showed it to Kara. And now I needed it, and I found it as a way of defining these milestones of life and finding my way back. And so it's so really unbelievable that this thing that I'd done for the future ended up actually helping me. So it is a powerful idea, and something that I really hope your audience will learn about and become curious about, and maybe consider doing it as this incredible gift to their children, to future generations. And then, God forbid, if something happens in your own life, you might find it as a treasure map to help you find yourself if you're lost.
I'm so grateful for you sharing that story. Thank you. And I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a question similar to your style, which is, if there's one piece of advice or a takeaway or a lesson or just a piece of hope that you have for anyone listening who's going through grief right now, a loss, what would it be now that you have had some
So,
time to reflect?
so since I have the benefit of having your audience here, I'm going to make it 2 things because it's so important that you have both. The first is, when something terrible happens, it's very easy not to take care of yourself. And I mean, the most basic things of like sleep and physical exercise, to actually, whether it's even just walking and getting outside, communicating with friends and family. What ends up happening when something terrible happens, it's so easy. I think our nature is to like go into the cave and to go into ourselves, and and you don't think that anybody can relate and truly understand. Like I remember talking to somebody and they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. I just lost my dog." And I inherited our daughter's dog, so nobody loves dogs more than Jill and I. but it just struck me as just an odd comparison of losing a child. And so it just causes you to go into yourself. So the first takeaway is it is so important to write down a list of things that you need to do in order to take care of yourself and do those things. Like keep that list by your bed as a daily checklist. And it's just the most basic things. I know it sounds rudimentary. Honestly, it's life saving and so important to give you the foundation from which to then rebuild. And then the second thing, which I hope provides loving hope to anyone listening or watching this, is that with the passage of time, if you give it time, even the most terrible things we can rebuild, and we even can come to a point of understanding and memories, beautiful memories of whatever it was that we had before that perhaps we've lost. And so those two things together are my lessons because I didn't do a good job taking care of myself. And that made it much, much harder to recover. And then I also, like an entrepreneur, was very impatient on when life would start to get better. And combination of those things, it was as though it's like fighting the two most important things, not taking care of yourself and then being impatient, not a good way to
Right.
recover.
Right. No, that's really, really important advice, and thank you for sharing that. Going back to what you were saying about the family meeting, I feel like in our household, we have little meetings all the time in the car, before school, on the walk to school, and however you do it as a family. But I love the intentionality of once a week. And especially when they're young, it's hard to wrangle them maybe when they're teenagers. Did you continue doing it until the end of high school?
Yes, we did weekly meetings through high school. Is it possible that we missed a week here or there? Of course, sometimes life got in the way, but generally maintained this cadence of weekly meetings. And then when the kids went off to college, we moved to quarterly, where we would, at least on a quarterly basis, have a family
Wow.
meeting with an agenda and topics. And I kept a list. In fact, I'm happy to share it with you and you can look at it. And if you think it's something to share with your audience, happy to do it. But I kept a list of all the things. Most of them are still related to when they were young, but it's really incredible. Everything from where did I come from? And kids love their origin stories all the way through to even the day that they were born. They love that. To things like planning a family vacation together and letting the kids actually get involved in planning something together. A service activity. I remember when our youngest Jake was probably 8 or 9, and he had to plan an afternoon of service at our local food bank. And I could just see how he felt like such a big boy by having to get involved and being responsible and inviting his grandparents to come and that sort of thing. The funniest thing of all is our most famous family meeting, the one that if our kids were on with us right now at 31 and 36 and you said, "Boys, what was your favorite family meeting?" I ran a fire drill once a year, and the kids would get in their pajamas and they'd get into bed, and I'd call the alarm company and said, "I'm doing a test." And I'd set the alarm off in our house, and they had to actually pretend it was a fire and do all the things that you're supposed to do. And they just loved the fire drill. It was pretty
Oh my
funny.
gosh. That would not go well with my 9-year-old.
I don't know. You might be very popular running fire drills.
Although my son maybe, because until he was about 4, the only 2 sounds he ever made was "wee-oh, wee-oh," for
Okay.
about the first 48 months of his life. Eric Becker, what a treat, what an honor to be with you on this episode, and I look forward to subscribing to your podcast, The Long
Thank you.
Game, which is
Thank
also
you.
the title of your book, The Long Game: A Playbook of the World's Most Enduring Companies. Thank you for all that you've shared, and wishing you and your family continued success.
To you too. Thank you so much for doing this. And you have an incredible way. You're such a curious person. And so I love how this interview went. And thank you so much for all that you do for your audience and for the community.
My pleasure.